Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
It's great to be back. I think today's topic is, well, it's one of those foundational ones that really gets to the heart of how we see the world.
Absolutely. We're going a bit deeper than usual, I think, into the very architecture of how we build knowledge.
We really are. We're looking at a fundamental duality, two concepts, Hakikat and Gerçek.
Right, and in English, we might roughly translate Hakikat to something like absolute truth or universal reality.
And then Gerçek is, well, it's what we experience, our observable reality, the facts on the ground.
The tricky part, though, is that in everyday language, we treat them as if they're the same thing.
We do, and that's where the confusion and frankly the danger lies. They come from completely different conceptual roots.
So our mission today, really, is to unpack that separation. We want to understand why the reality you live in is, and this is the key, inherently flawed.
And why that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And also how a very specific tool-controlled skepticism is what you need to make that reality better.
Okay, let's start at the top with the big idea, Hakikat. When we say absolute truth, what are we really talking about?
You should think of Hakikat as the total unchangeable ideal. It's the universe as it actually is, completely independent of us.
Independent of any observer, any language.
Exactly. The old roots of the word, from Aramaic and Arabic, have this sense of being etched in stone. It's permanent, inviolable.
People sometimes describe it metaphorically, don't they? Like a gas or something up in the clouds.
Yes, something perfect but fundamentally inaccessible to us. It just is.
So if Hakikat is that perfect, untouchable ideal, then our reality, our Gerçek, must be a product of our minds trying to interpret it.
That's the perfect word for it. Gerçek is the projection. The source used of the term is dushimu, a shadow of that absolute reality onto our perception.
So the human mind takes this infinite complexity.
And it molds it, it limits it, filters it, shapes it into something we can actually process, something we can use.
But right there, in that act of processing, that's where the flaw comes in. The sources are very clear on this. Her Gerçek Kusurludur. Every reality is flawed.
And that sounds so negative, doesn't it? But it's not a bug in the system.
It's the most fundamental feature.
It is. It's a required limitation. Our minds are simply not built to handle absolute truth. Think about it. To see the full, thin slice of Hakikat would mean processing an infinite number of data points all at once.
You wouldn't be able to walk across a room.
You'd be paralyzed by cognitive overload. You'd be calculating every gravitational fluctuation, every air molecule. The filtering is what allows us to function.
This brings us to that fantastic map analogy. When you use a navigation app on your phone.
Right, that map is, it's radically incomplete, isn't it?
Completely. It leaves out everything. The smell of the air, the cracks in the pavement, the chemical makeup of the asphalt.
It leaves out 99.999% of actual reality. It's an incredibly basic, molded version of the world.
But that's exactly why it works.
That's why it's functional. It gives you only what you need. The route, the traffic, the destination. And our Gerçek is just like that. It's the mind's functional model of Hakikat. It's not the real world, but it's the only world where we can act.
And that idea of functionality, of utility, it's not just a philosophical concept. It's built right into the history of science.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the word mechanic. Mechanics.
You mean like in physics? The classic Newtonian versus quantum mechanics comparison.
It's the perfect example. We know for a fact that Newton's laws are incomplete. They're flawed.
They break down at the subatomic level or near the speed of light.
Right. So in the framework of Hakikat, they are just plain wrong. And yet
engineers use them every single day to build bridges and skyscrapers. Rocket scientists use them to get to the moon.
Because in most practical contexts, Newton's model is not just good enough, it's the ideal choice. You don't need quantum calculations to build a house. It would be insane.
So the early scientists called their work mechanics for a reason. They were emphasizing workability, function.
They understood they were creating functional models, not revealing the absolute mind of God. They prioritized pragmatic value over claiming they'd found the final truth.
So if this flawed functional reality is so incredibly useful, where's the catch? Where does the danger come from?
The danger isn't in the flaw, it's in denying the flaw exists. The source calls this ulis termak over-glorifying something.
And that can happen in two ways, right?
Exactly. Either you make the absolute Hakikat so sublime, so holy, that our practical world seems like garbage in comparison.
Or, and this is probably more common,
You take your current functional Gerçek, your current model, you declare that it is the absolute truth. that it's etched in stone.
You turn the map into the territory.
And at that moment, all progress stops. You've closed the door to improvement. Whether you make the ideal too high to reach or you make your current reality an idol, the result is the same: intellectual paralysis.
Which means we need a tool. Something to constantly check our models, to keep them from hardening into dogma.
And that tool is good faith skepticism. The Turkish word used is şif.
It's the instrument you use to avoid being, as the source says, hapis imprisoned by your own reality.
It's the commitment you make to the idea that a better model is always possible.
We have to constantly fight against what you could call the myth of completion, this idea that we figured it out.
Oh, it's intellectually fatal. Think of that old story, maybe apocryphal, about the U.S. Patent Office around 1912.
The idea that someone declared there's nothing left to discover.
Whether it happened exactly like that or not, the sentiment is real. It's a profound failure of doubt. It's what leads to stagnation.
And it's not just about stopping progress. It's about actively resisting new information. The source gives that great example of the entomology professor.
Yes, teaching his notes from decades ago as if they were absolute Hakikat even though the science had moved on. That's not teaching. That's enforcing a doctrine.
The story about the baby growth study is even more telling, I think.
I agree, because it shows how even our methods, our protocols, can become dogma.
So you have a scientist who actually observes that babies don't grow steadily. They grow in these big, sudden spurts over a single day.
An empirical observation. But it contradicted the established protocol, which was to measure babies only once a week.
And because the protocol, the established Gerçek of measurement, was considered untouchable.
The new observation was thrown out. The scientist was actually penalized for it. The flawed but comfortable model was protected at the expense of a newer, more accurate one.
It seems like the very thing that makes our reality functional, its simplicity, is also what makes it so fragile and prone to becoming dogma.
That's the paradox.
So how do we use this tool of skepticism without, falling into total cynicism, without being paralyzed by doubt?
And that's the crucial distinction. We have to talk about controlled doubt. This isn't about doubting everything.
You don't doubt gravity when you sit in a chair.
Of course not. And you don't doubt your love for your child. That would be pathological. This is about using doubt as a surgical instrument.
It has to be functional, just like the reality it's examining.
Yes. Its purpose is to create something better, a more accurate, more powerful model. You're not just tearing down what's there for the sake of it.
If you doubt the safety of a bridge, it's because you want to build a safer bridge.
Exactly. Skepticism is the engine of improvement, not destruction.
Now, this all gets exponentially more complicated when we move from the laws of physics to, say, human interaction.
Oh, it's a whole different ballgame. Because if Gerçek is molded by an individual mind,
then every single individual has their own unique model of reality. My map is different from your map.
and this is, without a doubt, the single most difficult cognitive exercise we face as a species.
Accepting that other people operate with functional realities that might not just be different from ours, but might directly conflict with ours.
We just assume. We assume, because we share a planet and a language, that our models should be identical. And when they're not, our first instinct is that the other person must be stupid or malicious or insane.
But the source material is very direct about this. It says, Gerçekler kıyaslanmaz. Realities cannot be compared.
This is so important. It's not saying all realities are equally true in an absolute sense. That's a misunderstanding.
It's not radical relativism.
No. It's acknowledging that because of a person's unique history, their biology, their experiences, they have constructed a Gerçek that is functional for them.
So if we can't compare them, what do we do? How does society even function?
We have to practice tolerance, which is really a form of cognitive empathy. You have to respect the internal validity of someone else's model, even if you profoundly disagree with its conclusions.
Because you recognize that they, like you, are working with a flawed, limited human system.
Precisely. That respect acts as a kind of social lubricant. It reduces the friction when two different realities inevitably rub up against each other.
It reframes conflict. It's not about good versus evil. It's about a breakdown in translation between two different functional models.
And thinkers throughout history have understood this gap, this space between the absolute ideal and our functional reality. They called it the axis mundi, the world's axis.
The space where new knowledge gets made.
It is. And the great figures, the Newtons, the Einsteins, they operate on that axis. They are, in a sense, translators. terkumanlık yapan, the source calls them.
They doubt the current map. They perceive some new coastline of the absolute Hakikat, and then they manage to translate that into a new, better, but still flawed map for the rest of us.
They push the boundaries. But even their brilliant translations are limited. They're limited by the most basic tool we have.
Language.
Language itself. I mean, the critique here is profound. Our language is English, Turkish, all of them are maybe, 10, 20,000 years old? They're incredibly primitive tools.
Wholly insufficient for the task of describing ultimate reality.
The sources suggest we'd need billions more concepts than we currently have.
Yeah.
So the very effort to tell the Hakikat, to put it into words, that is the real myth. We don't have the hardware.
So if the truth is inaccessible, our language can't describe it, and every reality we build is flawed, where does that leave us? How do we find strength in that?
We have to find value in the defect itself. We have to flip the script on the kusur, the flaw.
The flaw isn't a weakness.
The flaw is the source of our uniqueness, of our strength. Think about heroes in great literature. They're never perfect, are they?
No, they're always deeply flawed. Paranoid, obsessive, socially inept.
Exactly. And often, their greatest flaw becomes their greatest virtue, their mizietti. The paranoid detective sees conspiracies no one else does, and he turns out to be right.
His flawed perspective lets him see patterns that a normal, well-adjusted mind would just filter out.
Because the normal mind is satisfied with the standard issue Gerçek. The hero's mind isn't. And this applies to you, to everyone listening.
Your specific cognitive flaw, the unique lens through which you see the world, isn't something to be cured.
It's something to be harnessed. It's what allows you to generate unique insights, to innovate on the model, as long as you acknowledge that it is a flaw. It's always better to have a reality that knows it's incomplete than one that falsely claims perfection.
This brings us full circle then. Our job isn't to try and dictate what Hakikat is. That's just hubris.
Our job is the relentless, good faith, controlled improvement of our own functional, flawed Gerçek.
And that entire process, that entire journey, it all hinges on that one sharp, essential tool.
Good faith skepticism.
Yeah.
It's not cynicism. It's not an attack. It's the purest form of motivation there is. It's the engine of life, fueling the desire not just for a new reality, but for a better one.
And when you look back at history, the worst things didn't happen because of doubt. They happened because people declared certain ideas immune from doubt.
Absolutely. Think of science being held back for 1,000 years because Aristotle's ideas became dogma. The moment you say a concept, any concept, scientific, political, whatever, is too sacred to be questioned, you've planted the seeds of stagnation and suffering that can last for centuries.
So the final thought for you is this. Use your map. It's essential for getting through the day. But never, ever forget that it's just a map. Keep that tool of controlled, constructive skepticism sharp. It's how you'll evolve.
Success to you as you continue to navigate, question, and improve your own inherently flawed but perfectly functional reality.
Yeah.